the honourable member for Hartlepool on obtaining this debate in response to this public petition, this e-petition, which quite rightly has engendered a lot of support and interest up and down the country. It comes on the back, or at the same time, virtually, as the publication of the UN report, which shows the extinction rates accelerating nature's dangerous decline. And this report, which was from the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, raises some interesting points. It ascribes some of the loss of these natural species and habitat to changes in land and sea use, direct exploitation of organisms, climate change, pollution, and invasive alien species, the latter subject of which I instigated a debate here not long ago in terms of the importing of plants and trees and so forth from overseas. But it seems to me the one thing in the RSPB report which strikes a chord is where they state we cannot keep trying to squeeze nature into smaller and smaller spaces or demanding it fits in with our plans. Because, you see, the problem is that since 1970, the global human population has more than doubled from 3.7 to 7.6 billion. Since 1900, the average abundance of native species in most major land-based habitats has fallen by at least 20%. And there has been 100%, there will be 100% growth of urban areas. There has been since 1992. All of these things conspire to squeeze out nature, or if not to squeeze out nature, to squeeze it into a tighter spot, which is why I believe, suddenly and rather late in the day, other than some eminent members who are sitting around the chamber this afternoon, that we've woken up very late to all this. And there has to be a trade-off between economic growth and the need, for instance, to provide houses for people. Of course, no one debates that. And to balance it with the requirements to make sure that the built environment is actually sustainable by the natural environment. You can't have one without the other. Where would the world be without birdsong? A very sad place. Where would the world be without swallows? I haven't spotted a swallow in Devon, in my part of the world, at all this year. So not doing nothing is simply not an option. And I have to say, Mrs. McDonough, that I think for too long we have put up with some of the behaviour from the volume house builders. It is perhaps unfair to paint them all with the same brush. It's an easy thing to castigate, but somebody's got to build these houses, and I lament the fact that there aren't more local house builders. I think this government can do a lot more, they've said they're going to, in encouraging local house builders, smaller house builders, to play their role, those same house builders who were squeezed out by the last recession, because I think they are likely to build in a more sustainable and environmentally friendly way because they're from the communities in which they will be building. But time and time again, we have seen up and down the country these major volume house builders riding roughshod over local planning officers, because there aren't enough of them and many of them are not qualified enough, and changing the terms by which they develop, and too often squeezing out the natural environment. Now, I'm not against profit. I'm a conservative. I believe in profit. I believe in a rising tide lifts all ships. But I am a believer in responsible capitalism. And I think it's about time this government was, any government of any hue actually, was a little bit tougher with some of these volume house builders. And perhaps we, as members of Parliament, wouldn't have to put up with so many constituents, in a minute, with so many constituents complaining to us about shoddy finishes and the like.
thank the honourable gentleman for giving way, because the point that he's making about the volume house builders and a complete disregard, it seems to me, for some of the planning regulations that are in place have been reflected in my local authority area, where in Humberston, Persimmon have cut down around 200 perfectly healthy trees in order to build their properties without having the proper permissions in place. So they will now have to replant all of those trees, but they shouldn't have been removed in the first place. Does he agree with me that there should be much more enforceable action on these big build companies to make sure that they adhere to the rules that are laid down in the first place?
Well, I do agree and I don't agree. I agree that that sort of behaviour is wholly unacceptable. But I don't agree that they should be replacing like by like, if it is the case that they have done this where there have been TPOs or the like. If they've cut down a number of trees, they should be obliged to plant many, many times the amount of trees they've cut down in order to encourage a change in the pattern of their behaviour. And it comes down, I'm afraid, so often to the inability or the lack of local planning officers to actually challenge these large companies, because their local councils are terrified of being taken to appeal, because then they've got to fund it, and it becomes a vicious circle, and the win-win is for the volume house builders, as we've seen. But I say again to those volume house builders watching this debate, or representatives from them, that I do not paint them all in the same light. And that's one of my points I wish to conclude on. The government has been quite clear, it needs to be a little bit clear about what it's going to do about this. But why don't we have a register run by the department, naming and shaming the worst offenders? So we can actually see on a regular basis which house builders and developers are behaving responsibly and which are not. And then there's such things as shareholder action groups and others can actually vote at AGMs and so forth, and they can bring this to the attention of the board. I think naming and shaming in this instance is an extraordinarily good way to proceed. So I believe it's a time to stand up to this sort of abuse. Equally, although we are in this slight conundrum whereby I am castigating some of these volume house builders and at the same time recognising the fact we need to build more houses and quickly if we are to avert what is becoming a national crisis in getting younger people onto the housing ladder. And with the developers under the kind of scrutiny they are now, I would have thought it made eminent good sense from their point of view, from their own public relations. Indeed, if I was advising them, and I'm not available to advise them incidentally, but if I was advising them on public relations, I would say this is precisely the sort of headlines that we don't want to read about ourselves. I would be delighted so to do.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. And in my constituency of Blaydon, there are a couple of developments on greenfield sites. And I was very pleased to hear the honourable member for Hartlepool report that Bellway have now decided not to use netting, because in fact, until a few weeks ago, they had netted an area in my constituency where they're about to develop. And it caused, as he says, great uproar and consternation among people who were opposed to the development in the first place.
Well, I think that's very good. It just shows that some of these companies are more concerned about the environment than gross profit, or indeed, can I say, net profit. They should be concentrating on no netting, not net profit, in some instances. However, just to conclude, I would say that a list of offenders is a good thing. I don't think we should use a hammer to crack a nut here. And as always, as parliamentarians, we should only insist on proportionate legislation and if it is enforceable, at that. So I am not convinced, because I'm not really an environmentalist in this sense that I don't know, I'm not convinced whether it's, as I said at the beginning in my intervention, either desirable or practical just to ban netting of hedgerows and bushes and trees throughout the year. I don't know if that's practical or indeed desirable. But I do believe, as a start, and the Minister can say something about this, hopefully, when she concludes this afternoon's debate, I do think, as a start, that we should ban netting during the breeding season. And if we can achieve that this afternoon, then it seems to me we have not been wasting our time.